Hello, and greetings to all of my friends at the Future of Democracy conference. Thank you to Open Markets and Article 19 for inviting me to be part of this important proceeding. As you guys are all talking about, we're facing unprecedented attacks on democracy, human rights, and freedom all around the world, and we haven't seen anything like this in our lifetimes. The threats facing liberal democracies in Europe, in the US, are coming from foreign dictators, authoritarian leaders, wannabe tyrants, extremist groups, techno-fascists all over the world. Everyone who wants us to believe that democracy is dying and that resistance is futile and that nothing is worth fighting for anymore. Well, everybody at this conference has come together to say that's wrong. We can, we must, we will fight back against all of these dark forces that would undermine our democracy and our freedom in this century. This moment calls for transnational democratic solidarity among the free peoples, the free parties, and the free movements of the world. All the bullies and the oligarchs have found each other. They're networked together in a dark web of anti-democracy, from the autocrats in Moscow to the kleptocrats in Mar-a-Lago, from the far-right extremists of the National Rally to the techno-broligarchs of Silicon Valley. The enemies of freedom are on the march for autocratic state power and social control, creating gangster states and fascist networks around the world to try to intimidate people and to stop democracy. Well, let me just say a word about what's going on in the United States, so everybody has a clear sense of what's happening. There are unprecedented attacks, again in our lifetimes, on freedom of speech and efforts to silence dissent, efforts to undermine the independence and powers of the judicial branch, efforts to defy the will and laws of Congress and to stop Congress from conducting any oversight of the president and the executive branch. We see efforts by the president to exercise unilateral complete control over the professional civil service and to abolish the meaning of the civil service, which is that people can't be fired from jobs like air traffic controller and forest firefighter and cancer researcher for partisan reasons. But we're seeing the administration attack, bully, and threaten federal workers every day. We're seeing them attack, bully, and threaten private companies whose views and actions the president disfavors. They're coercing law firms simply because the president doesn't like something that one of the lawyers did, imposing guilt by association and collective guilt on an entire firm, threatening to bar them from federal buildings, which of course makes it difficult to practice in federal courthouses. They're revoking and freezing federal funding appropriated by Congress for addressing subjects they don't like, such as climate change or vaccines. They are trying to void out essential medical and scientific research. They're threatening colleges and universities that don't comply with the president's directives and that don't adhere to his ideological views. They're trying to take over our private colleges and universities, control the curriculum, control student admissions, control faculty hiring. They're revoking college student visas and detaining and deporting foreign students here on a visa simply because they went to a rally that the president didn't like, or they wrote an op-ed for a newspaper the president didn't like. They're filing baseless lawsuits against media companies simply because they report stories that the president doesn't like. The president could never win these lawsuits against ABC, CBS, NBC, 60 Minutes, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, you name it. But he has succeeded in coercing many of them into settlements by using the power of the Federal Communications Commission. In other words, using the power of the state to shake down private media companies for tens of millions of dollars that go into his pocket or for his presidential library. In one episode that became famous, they tried to force Disney and ABC to take down comedian Jimmy Kimmel, to remove his late night show from the air. It created a storm of protest and outrage across the country, and people began to feel those stirrings of the First Amendment and freedom of speech finally in the country, and people protested, and so Disney called it off. And that was a big victory for us, because if you can laugh at somebody in power, then you don't have to be afraid of somebody in power. So these comedians are playing an important role for us. And yet this shakedown, this crackdown continues. The president has ordered completely baseless criminal prosecutions against his political rivals, including the former director of the FBI, Mr. Comey, and the New York Attorney General, Letitia James. Now, despite this terrible onslaught of attacks on basic civil, political, and human rights, people are fighting back across the country, and the courts are fighting back as well. There have been more than 400 lawsuits brought since January against this reign of lawlessness and terror against the American people. And we have won the overwhelming number of lawsuits in federal district courts and at the appellate level, right after the district courts. Our problem has been the US Supreme Court, which has been gerrymandered and stacked and packed in Trump's favor. And so they've taken dozens of these cases and reversed them in their emergency docket, the so-called shadow docket, where they don't even explain their reasoning. They just issue a one sentence or one paragraph order reversing what's been done. But nonetheless, the rule of law is holding at the federal district court level. And many courts, whether it's a Democratic appointee to the bench or it's a Republican appointee to the bench, have rejected what Donald Trump has done. For example, one of his first executive orders was to try to strip birthright citizenship from people in America, essentially unilaterally overturning the very first sentence of the 14th Amendment, which says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Nothing could be cleaner or plainer in our history. Going back to 1868, Donald Trump tried to reverse that by executive order. It was struck down by 4 federal courts, 2 Republican judges, 2 Democratic judges. And their position was validated at the appeals court level. But the US Supreme Court changed the subject and said that they actually didn't have the power to impose nationwide injunctions, federal district courts. So now we're having to reinvent the wheel, start all over again, and do it as a class action in a couple of different jurisdictions. And nonetheless, the federal judges are hanging tough and rendering very powerful opinions for us. On the international stage, our European allies are helping to put the brakes on for a number of different causes. For example, the European countries have stood strong with our democratic allies in Ukraine, fighting off Putin's filthy, bloody, imperialist invasion, and that has had a tempering influence on Donald Trump and his instinctive readiness to support Vladimir Putin. And every day we are seeing brave Americans all across the country stand up against what's taking place in our country. We've had millions of people participate in street protests with Indivisible, and we have another day of No Kings rallies taking place on Saturday, October 18th. So we are confronting a whole host of problems that I know you're talking about at the conference. I won't rehearse them for you, but we have serious problems with hate speech and fascist organizing taking place on the internet. We have problems with artificial intelligence. We have profound market concentration, economic monopolization, media consolidation, and then a war on the living standards of working class and middle class people in our country. They also are attacking science on a regular basis and defying what the scientists have told us about what's taking place with climate change. On top of all of this, we have inflation, which Donald Trump had promised that he would get rid of at the very beginning of his term. So the good news is this president is sinking in the polls because of his terrible policies, including the trade war he's launched against the entire world with illegal, unconstitutional tariffs that themselves have been struck down in our Court of International Trade and in the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. So we have a very big agenda ahead of us, and I just want everybody there to know you've got allies in Congress, you've got allies all across America who are fighting to defend strong democracy and freedom. We must invent new tactics of nonviolent resistance and opposition to this authoritarian drive in our society and around the world. As our case is new, said President Abraham Lincoln, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves from all the propaganda, all of the dogma, and all of the fake news in order to save our democracy. And that means saving both the rights and practices that constitute democracy today, but also understanding that democracy is always an unfolding project. It's a process in motion. And in America, we've got a long way to go to reach Abraham Lincoln's beautiful, tantalizing ideal of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We've got millions of people still disenfranchised in America. We've got the residents of a national capital who are the only residents of national capital on planet Earth who are not represented in their own parliament. And so we need statehood for Washington, D.C. We need statehood for Puerto Rico. We need a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. And we need to get rid of the antiquated and accident-prone electoral college system, which has given us 5 popular vote losers as president in our history, twice in this century alone. So we have a lot of work to do. But like John Dewey said, the only solution to the ills of democracy is more democracy. And what we're suffering from today is not democracy. What we're suffering from is all of the impediments to democracy, the obstacles to democracy, and the attempts to trample and violate democracy. So we stand in solidarity with what you're doing. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person. The Republicans have shut the government down, and we are here in Washington waiting to reopen the government and preserve the health care of our people. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your commitment to democracy and the freedom that it protects. Thank you for standing strong in these very tough days.